He was not the most powerful dictator of his era. He was not the most feared, but what Benito Mussolini did with the power he held, and how he held it, left a record that continues to disturb historians more than 80 years after his fall. Some of it was calculated, some of it was reckless, and some of it was so brazen that even the men who opposed him could not quite believe what they were seeing. This is what Mussolini actually did. In October 1922, Benito Mussolini organized one of the most audacious political gambits in modern European history. He did not seize power through a military coup in the traditional sense. He staged a spectacle, a march on Rome by tens of thousands of black-shirt militiamen, the paramilitary arm of his fascist movement, and then used the threat of that spectacle to walk through a door that Italy's political establishment held open for him. The march itself was less militarily formidable than it appeared. Many of the black-shirts who converged on Rome in late October were poorly armed, inadequately organized, and would have been suppressed without great difficulty had the Italian army been ordered to stop them. King Victor Emmanuel III had that option. His generals told him the army would hold. He hesitated anyway, and then, on October 29, 1922, he invited Mussolini to Rome to form a government. Mussolini arrived by train, not at the head of a marching column, but in a sleeping car from Milan, wearing a black shirt and spats. He presented himself to the king and accepted the mandate to govern. Within weeks, he was Prime Minister of Italy. What followed over the next several years was a systematic and methodical destruction of Italian democratic institutions. Mussolini did not announce that he was building a dictatorship. He built it incrementally, piece by piece, using the machinery of the existing state against itself. In 1923, he pushed through the Acerbo Law, which changed Italy's electoral rules so that any party receiving at least 25% of the vote would automatically receive 2/3 of the seats in parliament. The 1924 elections, conducted under this system and accompanied by widespread intimidation and fraud, gave Mussolini's coalition an overwhelming parliamentary majority. The most significant turning point came in June 1924, when Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist member of parliament, stood before the chamber and delivered a detailed denunciation of the election fraud. He had documented the violence, the ballot manipulation, the intimidation of voters. He named names. He called for the results to be annulled. 11 days later, Matteotti was abducted from a Rome street in broad daylight by a group of fascist operatives. His body was found in a field outside the city 2 months later. He had been stabbed multiple times. The murder shocked Italy. Opposition politicians walked out of parliament in what became known as the Aventine Secession, hoping that public outrage would force the king to act. Victor Emmanuel III did nothing. Mussolini weathered the crisis, and in January 1925, he stood before parliament and took personal responsibility for everything the fascist movement had done, daring his opponents to remove him. None of them could. Within months, he had abolished the free press, dissolved opposition parties, and declared himself Il Duce, the leader. The democracy that Italy had built since unification was gone. What replaced it was something Italy had not seen before, and what Mussolini chose to do with that unchecked authority would define the next 20 years of Italian history. Having secured political power, Mussolini turned to the task of making that power total. The instruments he constructed to achieve this were not improvised. They were designed, refined, and embedded into Italian society with a thoroughness that shaped daily life for millions of people across the country. The first and most visible instrument was the OVRA, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism, established in 1927. The OVRA was Mussolini's secret police. Its exact size was never officially disclosed, which was partly the point. Mussolini wanted Italians to believe it was everywhere, watching everything, because an inflated fear of surveillance was itself a tool of control. The OVRA infiltrated anti-fascist organizations, monitored mail, ran informants in neighborhoods and workplaces, and delivered suspects to the Special Tribunal for the Defense of the State, a parallel court system created specifically to handle political offenses. The Special Tribunal operated outside the normal Italian judiciary. Its judges were military officers, not civilians. Its procedures offered defendants limited ability to mount a genuine defense. Between 1927 and 1943, the tribunal processed thousands of cases and handed down sentences ranging from internal exile confinement to remote villages in southern Italy, or the island of Lipari, to terms of imprisonment in facilities where conditions were often severe. Internal exile, known as confino, was one of the regime's preferred methods for dealing with political opponents who were too prominent to disappear quietly, but too troublesome to leave in circulation. Intellectuals, labor organizers, former politicians, and journalists were sent to isolated villages in Calabria or Basilicata, cut off from their networks, their work, and their families. Some spent years in confino. The intent was not only to silence them, but to erase them from public consciousness, to make them, for all practical purposes, cease to exist. The press was an equally critical instrument. Mussolini had been a journalist before he was a politician. He had edited the socialist newspaper Avanti before breaking with the left over Italy's entry into World War I, and he understood the power of the printed word better than most. Once in power, he systematically brought the Italian press under state control. Editors who published criticism were replaced. Publications that resisted were shut down. By the late 1920s, Italian newspapers printed what the regime wanted them to print, and what the regime wanted them to print was a continuous, elaborately constructed image of Mussolini as a brilliant, tireless, infallible leader guiding Italy toward greatness. The personality cult that developed around him was cultivated with extraordinary care. Photographs were controlled. Images of Mussolini showing weakness, age, or uncertainty were suppressed. His speeches were designed for mass performance, with call and response patterns that turned crowds into participants. His face appeared on posters across the country. Slogans attributed to him were painted on walls in towns and villages, from the Alps to Sicily. Children were enrolled in fascist youth organizations, the Baliglia for boys, the Piccole Italiane for girls, where they were taught to see loyalty to Il Duce as inseparable from love of Italy. The apparatus of the regime reached into schools, universities, professional organizations, and cultural institutions. Academics were required to swear an oath of loyalty to the fascist regime. Only a handful refused. 12 out of approximately 1,200 university professors declined to take the oath and were dismissed. The rest complied. The theater, cinema, and radio were marshaled in service of the state's image. And at the center of all of it stood Mussolini, projecting an image of absolute authority that his actual grip on power could not always sustain. The regime also invested heavily in the bodies and minds of Italian youth. Young Italians growing up under fascism knew nothing else. The youth organizations drilled loyalty to the state as a first principle, ahead of family, religion, or independent thought. Summer camps, athletic competitions, and paramilitary training were framed as gifts to the next generation, preparation for the great national destiny that fascism promised. By the late 1930s, a generation of Italians had been educated entirely within the regime's framework, and the question of what Italy looked like without Mussolini at its center had become almost literally unimaginable to millions of them. What the Italian people living under this system saw every day was a country that appeared to be functioning, even thriving. Public works projects, trains running on improved schedules, a government that projected energy and purpose. What they could not easily see was the machinery operating underneath that surface, and what was coming next would make that machinery far more difficult to ignore. If there was a single act during Mussolini's reign that demonstrated the distance between his public image and his actual conduct of power, it was the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 and 1936. What happened during that campaign crossed lines that even some of Mussolini's European admirers found difficult to defend. Ethiopia, then known internationally as Abyssinia, was one of only 2 independent African nations that had survived the European colonial scramble of the late 19th century. It was a member of the League of Nations, the international body established after World War I, to prevent exactly the kind of aggressive war that Mussolini was planning. Italy had attempted to conquer Ethiopia once before, in 1896, and had been humiliatingly defeated at the Battle of Adwa. Mussolini intended to erase that memory. The Italian invasion began on October 3, 1935, with a massive combined arms assault from Italian Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. The Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, commanded an army that was courageous but critically under-equipped, soldiers carrying rifles and spears against Italian tanks, artillery, and aircraft. What distinguished the Italian campaign from a conventional war of conquest was the systematic use of chemical weapons. Mussolini authorized the use of mustard gas against Ethiopian forces and civilians. The gas was delivered by aircraft, dropping it in liquid form over Ethiopian troop concentrations, villages, and, in what military historians have documented as a deliberate strategy, Red Cross medical facilities. Mustard gas causes severe chemical burns to the skin, eyes, and lungs. It does not kill quickly. Victims suffer for hours or days. Ethiopian soldiers who had never encountered chemical weapons before had no protective equipment and no treatment protocols. Haile Selassie later stood before the League of Nations in Geneva and described what his people had experienced: a first-hand account of civilians burned by substances falling from the sky, of medical workers targeted alongside combatants, of a weapon that made no distinction between soldiers and the populations they were defending. The use of chemical weapons violated the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which Italy had signed. It violated the laws of war, as they were then understood. It violated the terms of Ethiopia's membership in the League of Nations, which was supposed to guarantee its territorial integrity. Mussolini did not deny the use of gas. He defended it. Italy's military commander in Ethiopia, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, oversaw the campaign with an operational ruthlessness that extended beyond the chemical weapons program. Villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were bombed. Reprisals against civilian populations were systematic. After an assassination attempt against his successor, Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, the Italian administration in Addis Ababa carried out a massacre that lasted 3 days, during which thousands of Ethiopian civilians were killed by Italian troops and black shirt militia. The Addis Ababa massacre of February 1937 was one of the most significant atrocities committed by any European colonial power in Africa during the 20th century. It was ordered in response to a bombing attack, and it targeted not just those responsible but the broader Ethiopian population, intellectuals, clergy, and ordinary residents who happened to be in the wrong place. The League of Nations condemned Italy and imposed economic sanctions. The sanctions were limited, the enforcement was inconsistent, and they did not stop the conquest. Ethiopia fell. Mussolini declared the Italian Empire on May 9, 1936, and presented Victor Emmanuel III as its new emperor. The crowd in the Piazza Venezia roared. Outside Italy, the picture looked considerably different. For much of the 1930s, Mussolini's relationship to racial ideology was opportunistic rather than principled. He had shown limited interest in biological racism during the early years of his regime, and Italian fascism, as it developed in the 1920s, had not placed race at the center of its doctrine, the way German National Socialism would. There were Jewish members of the early fascist movement. Mussolini himself had Jewish associates and collaborators. That changed in 1938, and the change was deliberate, rapid, and devastating for the Jews of Italy. The reasons for the shift were partly strategic. Mussolini's alliance with Adolf Hitler, formalized in the Rome-Berlin axis of 1936 and deepened through the subsequent years, created pressure to align Italian policy more closely with German ideology. But Mussolini was not simply following Hitler's lead. He presented the racial laws that his government introduced in 1938 as an expression of fascist doctrine, not as an import from Germany. He wanted credit for the policy, not merely complicity in it. The Italian racial laws of 1938, formally titled the Defense of the Race legislation, stripped Italian Jews of citizenship rights, expelled Jewish children from state schools, removed Jewish teachers and professors from their positions, barred Jews from the military, from government employment, from owning businesses above a certain size, and from employing non-Jewish Italians in their households. Mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews were prohibited. Jews who had been granted Italian citizenship after 1919 were required to leave the country. The laws affected approximately 47,000 people. The Jewish community in Italy was old, deeply assimilated, and had provided substantial contributions to Italian cultural and professional life. Many Italian Jews had fought for Italy in World War I. Many had been members of the Fascist Party itself. None of that protected them. The enforcement of the racial laws varied across the country and was, in the early years, less immediately lethal than what Jews faced in Germany at the same period. But the laws imposed real and severe damage on the lives of those affected. Careers destroyed, families disrupted, children removed from schools and separated from their peers, professionals stripped of their livelihoods. What Mussolini could not fully anticipate, or perhaps chose not to, was where the logic of those laws would lead once Germany occupied northern and central Italy, following the Armistice of September 1943. With the German occupation came the Gestapo and the SS, and with them came deportations. Italian Jews who had lived through the fascist years under the racial laws now faced transport to the Nazi death camps in Poland. More than 7,000 Italian Jews were deported. The majority did not return. Mussolini had not built the camps. He had not ordered the deportations, but he had built the legal architecture that identified, registered, and stripped the rights from Italian Jews. And that architecture was precisely what made the deportations possible once German forces took control. The Jewish community of Rome, one of the oldest in the world, tracing its presence in the city back more than 2,000 years, lost over 1,000 members in the roundup of October 16, 1943. They had been made vulnerable by years of fascist legislation, and the man who had signed that legislation was still alive, still nominally in power in the puppet state Germany had set up for him in northern Italy. By 1939, Mussolini had grown accustomed to international success achieved through aggression. Ethiopia had fallen, Austria had been absorbed by Germany, Czechoslovakia had been dismembered at Munich. The pattern suggested that bold action, backed by military force or the credible threat of it, produced results. Mussolini intended to keep producing results. On April 7, 1939, Good Friday, Italian forces invaded Albania. The Albanian king, Zog I, fled within days. Albania was absorbed into the Italian kingdom, with Victor Emmanuel III adding a second crown to his collection. The operation was swift, the resistance was limited, and the acquisition gave Italy a foothold on the eastern shore of the Adriatic Sea. What the Albanian operation also did was reinforce Mussolini's conviction that the Italian military was capable of rapid, successful offensive action. That conviction was not well founded, and it would produce consequences that severely damaged Italy's position in the war, and Mussolini's standing with his German allies. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, and French resistance collapsed with startling speed, Mussolini made the decision to enter the war on Germany's side. Italy declared war on France and Britain on June 10, 1940, joining a conflict that Mussolini expected would be over in weeks. He wanted to arrive at the peace conference as a victorious belligerent and claim territorial concessions. What he got instead was a series of military humiliations that progressively undermined everything he had constructed. The most damaging of these came in Greece. On October 28, 1940, Mussolini launched an invasion of Greece from Albania without notifying Hitler in advance. He had decided to pursue his own parallel war of conquest, what he called his parallel war, independently of Germany's campaigns. He expected Greece to collapse quickly. It did not. The Greek army, fighting on mountainous terrain it knew intimately, stopped the Italian advance within days and then pushed the Italians back into Albania. By December 1940, Greek forces had occupied a significant portion of Albanian territory. Italian troops were fighting in winter conditions in the Albanian mountains, suffering from cold, supply failures, and the grinding attrition of a campaign that had gone catastrophically wrong. The failure in Greece forced Hitler to intervene. In April 1941, German forces invaded Yugoslavia and Greece to rescue the Italian position and secure the Balkans before the planned invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler made clear, in terms that were not diplomatic, how he viewed Italy's performance. The relationship between the two dictators, which Mussolini had always treated as a partnership of equals, had shifted irrevocably. Italy was now the junior partner in a way that could not be disguised. The military failures accumulated. Italian forces in North Africa were repeatedly driven back by British and Commonwealth troops. The Italian Navy suffered serious losses at the Battle of Taranto in November 1940, when British carrier-based aircraft struck the Italian fleet at anchor. Italy's East African Empire, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Italian Somaliland, was conquered by British and Commonwealth forces by November 1941. The war that Mussolini had entered expecting a quick return was becoming a disaster, and as the disasters mounted, the men around him, including some of the most senior figures of the fascist movement itself, began to draw conclusions about what had to happen next. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. The island fell in 38 days. For the fascist Grand Council, the body that had, in theory, always held supreme authority in the regime, this was the breaking point. On the night of July 24th to 25th, 1943, the Grand Council met in emergency session and voted on a resolution that effectively stripped Mussolini of his military command and restored authority to the king. The vote was 19-7. Among those who voted against Mussolini was his own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, the foreign minister. The following afternoon, Mussolini was summoned by King Victor Emmanuel III. The king informed him that his government had come to an end. As Mussolini left the royal audience, he was arrested by carabinieri, waiting outside and taken away in an ambulance. He had ruled Italy for more than 20 years. It had taken a single afternoon to remove him. He was held at a series of locations, first on the island of Ponza, then on La Maddalena off Sardinia, and finally at the Campo Imperatore Hotel, high in the Gran Sasso Mountains of central Italy. The Italian government, under the new Prime Minister Pietro Badoglio, was negotiating secretly with the Allies for an armistice. Germany, however, was not willing to accept the loss of its principal ally without a response. Hitler ordered an operation to rescue Mussolini, and on September 12, 1943, 2 days after the Italian armistice with the Allies was announced, a team of German SS paratroopers and special forces landed by glider on the mountain plateau where Mussolini was being held. They took the facility without firing a shot. Mussolini was flown out in a small aircraft and delivered to Hitler. The rescue was presented in German propaganda as a triumph of loyalty and daring. What it actually produced was a hollowed-out relic of a regime. Hitler installed Mussolini as the head of the Italian Social Republic, known as the Republic of Salo, after the northern Italian town where some of its ministries were located. It was, from the first day, a puppet state. German forces controlled the territory. German officials made the decisions that mattered. Mussolini signed documents and made speeches. What the Republic of Salo is remembered for above all is what Mussolini did with what little authority he had left. The men who had voted against him in the Grand Council meeting of July 24th were hunted down. Galeazzo Ciano, his own son-in-law, married to his daughter Etta, was arrested, tried before a fascist tribunal in Verona, and executed by firing squad on January 11, 1944. Mussolini did not intervene to save him, despite appeals from Etta that were, by multiple accounts, desperate and prolonged. Ciano died facing the firing squad, having turned his chair around and looking over his shoulder at the men who shot him. 5 other members of the Grand Council who could be captured were also executed. The Verona trials were conducted with the procedural form of justice and none of its substance. The verdicts were decided before the proceedings began. The Republic of Salo lasted 20 months. During that time, the war closed in from every direction. The Allies moved slowly up the Italian peninsula. The German occupation of northern Italy brought with it the full apparatus of Nazi terror: deportations, reprisals against partisan fighters, massacres of civilians. Mussolini was present in name over a territory that was being destroyed. By April 1945, the end was hours away. On April 25th, partisan forces rose across northern Italy. German commanders in Italy were already in secret negotiations for surrender. On April 27th, Mussolini was stopped at a checkpoint on Lake Como while attempting to flee toward the Swiss border, reportedly hidden in a German military convoy. He was taken into custody by communist partisans. The following day, April 28, 1945, the same day Hitler was in his Berlin bunker in the final hours before the end, Mussolini was shot on a road near the village of Giulino di Mezzegre, along with his companion, Clara Petacci, and 15 other fascist officials. Their bodies were then transported to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of a petrol station on the Piazzale Loreto, the same square where fascist forces had publicly displayed the bodies of 15 executed partisans the previous year. The images of that final display traveled around the world. They were, in their own way, as deliberately staged as any piece of fascist propaganda. A mirror held up to the spectacle politics that Mussolini had practiced his entire career. The accounting of what Mussolini's regime produced over its 21 years in power is not easily reduced to a single narrative. The Ethiopia campaign killed hundreds of thousands of people through combat, chemical weapons, and deliberate reprisal operations. The racial laws of 1938 destroyed careers and families, and built the legal framework that enabled deportations under German occupation. The alliance with Hitler extended a war that cost Italy hundreds of thousands of military and civilian lives. The physical destruction of Italy's cities and infrastructure in the last 2 years of the war, much of it a consequence of the choices Mussolini had made in entering the conflict, took a generation to repair. The fascist movement that Mussolini created became a template for authoritarian political movements across Europe and beyond. The staging of politics as performance, the cultivation of a leader's image as a substitute for policy, the use of paramilitary violence against political opponents, the capture of state institutions for partisan purposes. These were not inventions of Italian fascism alone, but Italy under Mussolini demonstrated how they could be assembled into a functioning system of government and maintained for 2 decades. What Mussolini's career also demonstrated was how much damage a political system built around a single personality could sustain before it collapsed. Italy's democratic institutions, its press, its judiciary, its military command structure, all of it was subordinated to the will and the image of one man. When that man's judgment failed, in Greece, in North Africa, in the decision to enter the war, there was no corrective mechanism, no independent press to raise the alarm, no parliament to demand accountability, no military leadership willing to tell him what he did not want to hear. The failures compounded until the system broke. The verdict of his own fascist colleagues, expressed in the Grand Council vote of July 1943, was in some ways the most damning possible judgment on his legacy. The men who had built the regime with him, who had sat in his cabinet and carried out his orders for 20 years, voted to remove him when the consequences of his decisions could no longer be managed. Not because they had rediscovered their principles, because the system had failed and they needed someone to hold responsible. Mussolini spent 21 years building a state that answered to him and him alone. In the end, it could not survive the test of the war he chose to fight. What it left behind was a ruined country, a compromised generation, and a record that continues to be studied, not as a curiosity, but as a warning about where unchecked political power reliably leads. The speed with which a functioning democracy can be dismantled, the ease with which institutions can be captured and turned against the people they were built to protect, the distance between a leader's cultivated image and the reality of his conduct. All of it is documented in the 21 years of Mussolini's Italy, available to anyone willing to look at it honestly. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.